Right On Press Nigeria presents Herbal Essence, a Right On Press feature, narrated by Felicia Norman. Soren knew when he met Juliet that it was possible he'd outlive her. Of course, every relationship poses that awful possibility, but women on average live longer than men. Women who don't have AIDS, that is. Juliet was honest about her diagnosis from the start, though. He had plenty of warning. At first, it admittedly gave Soren pause. He was a student at the time studying biochemistry at Stanford. He'd been required to take many science classes and therefore possessed in-depth knowledge about the human body. He was aware of the advances made in HIV and AIDS treatment. He knew they could be together without him necessarily catching the disease. He knew she could very well live a long, happy life. He also knew none of this was guaranteed. It terrified him to think that this young woman he'd already befriended could be stolen from him. But he fell for her long before they started dating, so he accepted the risk. Juliet never told him how she contracted the disease. He never asked. It was part of their relationship, but a small part, something they didn't think about all that often. Or at least it wasn't something they talked about a lot. It was on Juliet's mind frequently as she managed her treatment. Once she became a therapist, she focused on clients dealing with illnesses and the host of mental health issues that can arise from such struggles. Likewise, when Soren decided to focus on cures for viral infections, it was for a reason. They both knew why. Soren hoped that with enough careful study, he could find a cure for her. He hoped he could eradicate any possibility that this disease could unravel their plans for the future. "I love you so much," she said as she took his hand. Her dark hair was limp against her pale, sunken cheeks. Her blue eyes were dulled with pain, yet she still smiled, just for him. He tried to smile back. He didn't look quite as sickly as she did, but almost. His blonde hair had grown out unkempt. Brown eyes were weary. He'd lost weight, only focusing on her needs as she deteriorated. Yet no matter what he did, she slipped further away from him. The bright lights of the hospital illuminated their struggle. The relentless beeping and sterile noises grated at the back of his mind. Soren tried to shut it all out, though, to be there with her in that moment. He didn't know how many moments they'd had left together. He couldn't allow himself to think like that. "I love you too," he said, his voice raw and shaking. "You're going to be okay, Juliet. You're strong, so strong. Think of all the things we planned." "I've lived an incredible life already," she assured her husband, "because of you. You know that, right? You've given me more than I could have ever hoped for. Our love story, it's been more than most people ever get. No matter what happens, I want you to remember that. Remember you made me so happy. Remember that I'd want you to move on and live your life. I'd want you to make all our dreams come true. For me." "Stop talking like that," he begged her, as the tears reappeared. Each time he thought there weren't any left, they crawled out from the IV bags and found their way down his cheeks. "We're going to make our dreams come true together. I can't even fathom losing you. I can't even comprehend a world in which I exist and you don't." "You knew from the start this could happen," she reminded him. "I made sure you did." "I know, but..." How could he explain to her how much things had changed? He had changed. He thought he could do this, but he couldn't. In hindsight, though, he knew something bad could happen. He never believed it would. He didn't think she'd get this sick. He thought he'd find a solution before then. He had been top of his class all throughout his school years. He always knew the answers, and if he didn't, he found them. He didn't know the answer to this riddle, though. He didn't know how to fix it. He hadn't found the right formula yet, and time was running out. "Just keep holding on, okay?" he begged her. "This isn't the end. It isn't. We can't give up. I'm with you. We'll do this together." "I'll always be with you," she promised him. He didn't like the way she said it. He couldn't find the words to explain why. He'd finally done it. It took years longer than he thought it would, but Soren had cracked the code. At first, the answer seemed so simple he didn't trust it, so he ran experiment after experiment to ensure the validity of his findings. Each test he ran gave him the same results. He had learned how to break down the compounds found in cannabis and mix them with various other ingredients to create a substance that could cure most viral infections. It was the breakthrough of his career. He'd be hailed a hero for decades to come. Finding this cure had been his life's mission since he met Juliet, and here he was, making it happen. He stood in front of the bathroom mirror, combing his hair back. The work and his findings would speak for themselves, of course. It didn't really matter what he looked like, but he wanted to appear professional. This was huge, and yet... He wiped away a stray tear that the bright lights had caught. The stall doors were open. He was the only one in here, and he was grateful for it. He sighed. His smile slipped. "I love you," he whispered, as if Juliet would be here of all places if she could appear wherever she wished to be. It had been 4 years since she passed, but not a day had gone by in which he hadn't thought of her. Thoughts of her death were no longer paired with every second, weighing down every breath. He could function in a way he couldn't for months after he lost her. To most people, it seemed like he was moving on. He couldn't really move on, though. He doubted he ever would. He hadn't dated anyone since then. He remained focused on his work, and it paid off. "I did this all for you," he said. He washed his hands, dried them, and it's going to help so many people. He left the bathroom and walked towards the presentation room with Juliet in mind. Her death was never worth it. Nothing positive came out of it, but he thought she might be proud of him regardless. He thought she might like to know that a cure had been found, even if it was too late to save her. She cared so much about other people. She would be thrilled about what his findings could do for humanity. Once upon a time, Soren might have been intimidated when stepping into the room where his benefactors waited. They'd funded his research without even inquiring into the detailed explanation of the work he was doing. They simply wanted a cure that would make them money. They paid him a lot of money to do so, and he still felt the weight of their expectations as he stood at the front of the room. He wasn't nervous, though. The worst thing had already happened to him. He wasn't scared of many things anymore. As he set up his presentation, they watched him. Robert and Walter were dressed in expensive business suits, their graying hair styled perfectly, gold rings on their fingers, critical eyes turned on him. Lauren was no less intimidating in her gray Chanel dress and black blazer. Her blonde curls were tucked back, allowing her piercing blue eyes to reveal her scrutiny. They were ready to point out any flaw in his work. Soren knew his research was flawless, though. "Good afternoon," Soren said, his voice steady and confident. "I'd like to thank you all for coming here today. I know you're busy and I appreciate you lending me your time. I promise you it will be worth it. You see, I found a cure for not only one viral infection. No, this solution targets almost all of them. Best of all, its main component is something we can produce a lot of fairly easily. Cannabis. Soren launched into the tests he'd run, research he spent hours conducting. He went into detail, ensuring they'd understand every bit of it and answered every question until they were satisfied. He spent hours in that room with them, and by the time he wrapped up, he was sure they'd be pleased. Who wouldn't be? This was the solution the world had been waiting for since these infections evolved. Could you give us some time to discuss this? Lauren asked. She wore a peculiar expression Soren couldn't quite place, but he wasn't perturbed by this. He agreed and stepped out of the room. He wasn't expecting to have to wait for long, but time stretched on and he became curious. What could they possibly have to discuss? Finally, once Soren was properly bored to death, he was allowed back in the room. He was asked to take a seat among them, which he took as the best sign he could get. Your research is impressive, Robert said. Finding a cure that could target so many infections is something we've all dreamed of, but haven't honestly believed would be brought to fruition. You've truly outdone yourself with this. Thank you, Soren said, beaming. However, we won't be able to sell this. Soren froze, then relaxed again. Really? He asked, a bit relieved. That was always the one drawback of conducting his research, the fact that these wealthy business people were going to be making such a huge profit off it. Soren was willing to give up all the money he'd be paid if that meant making it widely available to the people who needed it most. That's generous of you, Soren continued. I do believe such a huge advancement in vital treatments should be made available to everyone, regardless of their ability to pay for it. Robert's eyebrows raised as Walter and Lauren shared a look. I think you're misunderstanding what we're saying, Walter said slowly. We won't be able to sell this because we can't use cannabis to make such cures. It goes against everything we've been taught as Christians. More importantly, it goes against many of our major business partners' beliefs, which could cost us a great deal of money and hurt our reputations. Soren was so stunned. He couldn't say anything at first. They couldn't be serious. This was one of the biggest medical advances of their time. They couldn't dismiss it simply because they had an aversion to cannabis. Maybe this means God didn't want us to have the ability to cure these ailments, Lauren suggested. Or maybe he does, but in a different form. You should use this as inspiration to look into other avenues. Other avenues? Soren asked, incredulous. This is huge. This could save the lives of so many people while providing a better quality of life for those who may not die from their ailments but will suffer greatly from them. Furthermore, since these infections are viral, the more cases we treat, the less cases will be transmitted. In decades to come, we may very well be able to wipe out these infections completely. There's no time to look for different avenues. There may not be any other solutions out there. We need to take advantage of this. I'm sorry, Robert said. Our hands are tied. We can't condone this treatment, and we will have to take drastic action if you decide to pursue this matter further. We know many government officials would feel the same way, and who won't hesitate to shut this project down if it comes to that. As Lauren suggested, you should use this as a stepping stone to conduct further research and other solutions. Since you were able to find this cure, I'm confident you'll be able to find another. As far as cannabis goes, though, our minds are made up. This matter is settled. Soren sat at his laptop nursing a gin and tonic. He hadn't drank much since those first few months following Juliet's death. He didn't find it particularly helpful, and he wanted to keep a clear mind when approaching his search for a cure. Now all that seemed hopeless, though, and he didn't know what else to do. He looked out his window at the children playing across the street. Even in this idolized Dallas suburb, people were suffering from infections Soren knew how to cure. A cure that had yet to be put into practice 5 months after that disastrous presentation. They hadn't been lying about the government officials, even though the threat seemed ludicrous at the time. Shortly after the presentation, conservative senators reached out to Soren. They had more power than he imagined, and every time he tried to move forward with his research, they stood in the way. They had such a vendetta against cannabis usage that they were willing to do anything they could to block these results from being useful in any meaningful way. People were dying because of their biases, and Soren felt like a villain for being unable to do anything about it. He was still convinced there had to be something he could do about it. It was too awful that this was happening. Now there was a new pandemic on the horizon, and the death toll was only going to climb. Soren ate another slice of pizza. He had put on 20 pounds since then, an average about 5 pounds a month thanks to his new diet of unhealthy foods and too much alcohol. Yet try as he might, he couldn't suppress the frustration. He couldn't get away from this. There was one other option, or at least something he considered. He wasn't sure if it would work, and it would certainly be unpatriotic. If anyone found out, his freedom could be on the line. His life could be on the line. There could be disastrous repercussions. But his worst fear had already come true. Juliet was dead. There was no bringing her back. There was nothing they could do to him that would ever rival that kind of pain. He lived through the worst, so he no longer had to be afraid of anything. "What do you think?" he asked, gazing at a picture of Juliet in her wedding dress. She looked so happy, so full of life. Somewhere out there, another man's wife was dying. People were receiving diagnoses that would change their lives. Loved ones were mourning for people who could have been saved by Soren's findings. People whose lives ended because those in power didn't believe in the morality of the treatment that could end their suffering. Soren made up his mind. He took all the steps necessary to ensure anonymity. If this worked out how he hoped it would, he would never receive fame or fortune from his discovery. He'd never be credited for his hard work. If it didn't work, if he were found out, his life could be forfeited. They would find him. They would make him pay for this. But Soren didn't think his life was worth more than all the people who would die if he didn't publish this information. So after one more drink and 2 more slices of pizza, Soren sent his research findings out to the world on the web. He made sure those most important would see it. He did everything he could to ensure the information would reach people who had the power to use it, people who could create the cures that would make this all worth it. Then he packed up all the things he needed, all the things that mattered most to him. He grabbed his passport, dropped his apartment key off in his sister's mailbox along with a letter that explained as much as he dared to share without making her a target. He left, and the scientific community was sent into a frenzy. The border control was stricter than ever, and Lizzie was exhausted. The new variant of COVID had ravaged the United States in a way that was unprecedented. Cases were out of control, and most citizens weren't allowed to leave the country. Those who tried to flee to Mexico found it difficult to get in. The release of Soren's research had changed everything for them. Scientists from Mexico and Nigeria jumped on the chance that new information granted them. While other countries engaged in a war of politics as they decided what to do with these findings, plotting out the best way to approach such an advancement, Leaders of Nigeria and Mexico jumped right in. Neither country had the sort of resources needed to make this happen as quickly as they wanted, so they teamed up. They pooled their funds together to enable a group of their best scientists to create a vaccine that would eradicate most viral infections. They may have skipped over many of the usual precautions. Admittedly, rules were broken. People signed up for trials before the most thorough research had been done. Many found it to be worth the risk, though. Soren had already vetted everything so carefully that for the most part, these tests went flawlessly. They were able to do what needed to be done, and now they had leverage over everyone. The two countries had seen growth that was regarded as a miracle. They didn't hoard the cure per se, but they did use it as leverage. They quickly became economic and social world powers. Two countries that were previously ignored and often looked down upon became cherished. As for the United States, people still didn't know the full, true story yet. They never would, but they knew enough to be appalled, frustrated. The rest of the world looked on aghast as they learned that leaders in the United States had tried to suppress the wonder drug they were all now after. They hadn't learned their lesson, though. Congress was still fighting over if they should make this available to the public, which they proclaimed was because of moral reasons. The financial aspect was a large deterrent, too. Rioters stormed the streets. Chaos ensued while the world watched the downfall of the country. Lizzie watched her husband bargain with an official she wasn't allowed to get close to. Guilt weighed on her uncomfortably. She wasn't cold-hearted, no. She was self-aware enough to know this was wrong, but she'd do anything to feel better again. She looked down at her daughter, whose grip on her hand was growing weaker by the second. Her dark hair was limp, green eyes red and tired-looking. She'd do anything to save Eliza, anything. She'd never known such desperation in her whole life. Finally, they were allowed through. Eliza coughed as her mother ushered her back into their rover. Lizzie suppressed her cough until they were safely inside. Usually, they were accompanied by a driver, but this trip was so top secret that her husband was driving this time. He checked on his family before taking off into the country that was in the process of rebuilding and repairing all the things that had gone into disarray over the years. The sun splashed upon a culture that had come to life with the growing economy. Eliza gawked at the colorful traditional houses, the first time she'd shown interest in anything since she got sick. Diverse species of trees and plants were thriving among busy people until the coast took over further into their journey. Lizzie found hope as she gazed at water that was so blue it seemed impossible it was real. Clean, white sand followed them on their journey. She'd never been to Mexico. She wished she were here under better circumstances, but she was too exhausted to do much anyway. Her lungs were heavy as it became more difficult to breathe with each painful cough. She was cold no matter how many layers she wore, and her body ached. Overall, she felt awful, only made worse by the knowledge that her daughter was suffering in the same way. But by the end of the second day, they reached the treatment center, and she could envision an end to all of this. The 3-story building had once been abandoned, broken down. Many thought it would never be used again. Now, the white stones surrounded by lush green plants offered an oasis to those who were suffering. Warm light greeted them inside a building that was kept friendly with white, green, and blue decor. Plants, paintings, and fountains were an attempt to put patients at ease. The space was more modernized than Lizzie was expecting. The country had surprised her in many ways and made her look at life a bit differently. She vowed that when she returned to the States, she would do anything she could to help bring these advancements to the people left behind. For now, she stayed behind her husband to avoid spreading the virus. He checked in at the front desk. Then the family followed a receptionist to an office on the 3rd floor. Mr. Jones is ready for you, she said. He's been waiting for your arrival all day. Lizzie's husband stiffened. Mr. Jones? He asked, a note of worry in his words. Yes, a voice called from inside. Do come in, Robert. Robert looked at the receptionist, but she was already on her way back to her desk. Lizzie didn't understand her husband's reluctance, and he didn't try to explain as he led his family into the office. Robert, Soren beamed as he stood. It is so good to see you again. This must be your lovely family. Soren would never admit to it out loud, but it was incredibly satisfying to see Robert in his office with his beautiful wife and a daughter who was the exact replica of her. Things had worked out better for Soren than he ever thought it would when he left the country. He was grateful he'd chosen to flee to Mexico. It was the easiest border to get through, and they had been most welcoming to him. Once they learned who he was able to help them develop the cure and continue the work he started. Soren's research had saved so many lives he'd almost forgotten about those who turned him down. Yet, when he heard Robert had requested the treatment for his wife and daughter, he couldn't resist. Sit, won't you? He said, once introductions had been passed around. He motioned to the chairs in front of his desk. Robert hesitated, then took a seat in front of Soren. His wife sat at his side, their daughter on her lap. Look, I know I made a mistake, Robert said before Soren could even get another word out. I should have approved your research when you first brought it to my attention. I should have done everything possible to get the treatment made available to the public. But please, don't let my wife and daughter suffer because of me. They're so ill, and nothing we've done helps. Robert, what are you talking about? Lizzie interrupted. She didn't know anything about this, but she didn't like the look on Soren's face. She didn't like her husband's reaction. That's unfortunate, Soren said, ignoring Lizzie's question. I hear the United States is quite the hotbed for such illnesses lately. So many families find themselves in your predicament. So many people have already lost loved ones due to the government's ignorance. Robert started to panic. He had to find a way to save his wife and daughter, but Soren's expression was awakening a helplessness within him. Please, I'll give you anything. I'll pay any amount of money. Is that so? Soren asked, leaning back in his chair. Of course, Robert said. Name your price. Soren had been given plenty of time to contemplate this while he waited for Robert to arrive at his office, so he already knew how he'd respond. Still, he paused to make Robert sweat. He needed him to see just how much this was worth to him. I want all of it, Soren said. Excuse me? Robert replied. I want all of your money, every connection you have, all of your time to be put towards getting this cure widely circulated throughout the United States. I want you to get on the phone and make those calls. It's going to be a pricey venture, but I know your net worth. I don't care if you end up on food stamps after this. I don't care if you have to sell your businesses, though I doubt it'll get that far. You're a billionaire, Robert. It's time for you to put that money to good use. I'll give your daughter the cure once I see you've reached out to people and started the process. I won't cure your wife, though, until the citizens of the United States have access to this treatment. But that could take some time, Robert protested. I'll do what I can, but what if... He looked at his wife, too horrified to say it out loud. Guess you better get to work quickly then, Soren said. Money does wonders. I think you'll be able to make it happen. Do we have a deal? Robert closed his eyes. Yes, he muttered. He didn't waste any time getting started. The end. This completes the narration of Herbal Essence, a Write On Press feature, narrated by Felicia Norman, distributed by Write On Press for Write On Press Nigeria, copyright 2021.